Okay, thermocline of truth. This is so real. I can't tell you how many times I've run into this in reviewing, either doing a postmortem on a project or doing an actual review of an existing project. And thermocline, as we've talked about, if you've swum in a lake, you're very familiar with thermocline. Like the top foot, maybe 2 feet is warm. And you stick your foot below that, and suddenly it gets ice cold. You have it in oceans as well, but you have to go deeper typically to hit the thermocline. And I was first struck by this. I was working at Apple as a contract programmer. This was in late 1988 into early 1999, 1988 into 1989. And part of what I observed there was that the people I was working with were well aware of a lot of the problems with both the software and hardware. And the upper management was all like, things are great. And I kept thinking, why? Basically everything from the top kept floating down, but nothing from the bottom was able to move up beyond a certain point. And then as I became a project consultant, I ran into this more and more, that there's an actual layer there where, sometimes it can take 2 or 3 levels of management to screen all the bad news out. Sometimes it's a single person right there who just will not pass any honest assessment upstairs. And this is why when I'm called in to an organization like Capital One or someone like that to review an existing project, the first thing I do is I hold a bunch of interviews, and I always go and talk to the people who are down in the trenches working and say, okay, tell me how the project is going. And some of them, I automatically assume some of them are going to be disgruntled for various reasons, or they're just going to think people aren't listening to them, which is why I always talk to a lot of people. And I try to talk to as many people down in the trenches as I can, and usually by about the 4th or 5th interview, I'm starting to hear the same thing over and over again. It's like, okay, I'm seeing now where the core problems are, and then as I start to interview people who are up at levels of management, I'll hear some of those same concerns reflected, but then all of a sudden they vanish. It's like, okay, I just found the thermocline. People down in trenches know that things are bad. People at the very top think, oh, this is great, we're going to ship on time. And I'm the one who gets to pierce the thermocline and go up to upper management and say, no, actually it's not great. let me tell you why your project is scheduled to be very late. And these are the reasons. Some of the reasons why it forms. First is you have, and we talked about metrics last week, and this is often not an issue of not wanting metrics. It's just hard to come up with metrics that are objective, automated, and that will actually predict or accurately reflect project status, as opposed to lines of code written. Engineers can contribute because you're thinking, I'm sorry, got started, but you're working on this and say, this isn't going as fast, but I'll bet if I work a couple of nights and a couple of weekends, I'll get caught up. And that's always, let me just caution you against that when you get out in the real world. It is far better, the engineer's credo is under promise and over deliver. And it's very easy as engineers to want to over promise. And we often end up under-delivering as a result. And that's sort of like the worst of both worlds there. So, you have self-protection on the part of managers going up the chain. The manager is, he or she is evaluated on the project, so the last thing you want to do is go to their own boss and say, oh no, this project's in real trouble. And they'll say, oh yeah, we've got it under control. We have to put in a little extra overtime, but we can get this done. And then, and this is really the core problem here, is too often in organizations, top management rewards good news and punishes bad news. The management attitude, particularly sort of the East Coast management attitude, is, I don't want to hear about problems, I want to hear about solutions. It's like, well, no, actually, we have to talk about the problems. Because the problems are endemic, they are rooted in the very nature of the project itself. And there may not be solutions, and we're back to managing for potential failure. And we're back to what we've talked about. Brooks talks about this, I've talked about this, the classic syndrome. You get within the magical 3 weeks of the deadline, and suddenly it's like, oh, we have to slip 6 months. What happens is the closer you get to the deadline, the harder it is to hide the trouble the project is really in. And this sort of forces the truth up one management layer at a time, and it reaches top management typically, like I said, classically 3 weeks before ship. I mean, that obviously is a simplification, but be surprised how often that happens. Now, how do you avoid thermocline? First, the engineers and managers have to be willing to be honest, which doesn't solve everything, because often it won't get passed up. Upper management has to reward honest evaluation of where you're at. They have to take it seriously. You can't do this, I don't want to hear about problems, I want to hear about solutions crap. That's not management. That's browbeating. Upper management needs to actively bypass the chain. If you want to be a really great person in upper management that's over IT projects, go talk to the engineers on a regular basis. Take them out to lunch. Go sit in their office and say, so tell me, really, how's this project going? And you'll get an earful. And avoid the temptation of the quick fix to slip. Well, what's it take to bring this, to get this delivered? I've mentioned before the half billion dollar project at an unnamed financial corporation, not Capital One, since I already named them. I was brought in to review. It had been going, it was supposed to be 2 years, 180 million. I was brought in as head of a team to review it. At that point, it had been going on 4 years. They'd spent $500 million. And literally, the question I was asked is, what do we need to do in order to get this into production? And we spent 3 months. This was not a quick and dirty evaluation. We spent 3 months evaluating every aspect of this software. And I basically came back and said, you have nothing that's ready to go into production at all. And to get stuff ready for production, you have to go back and do some architecture. You have to establish a real quality assurance team. You have to do this. And I gave this presentation to the senior vice president who was over this, and then there was a layer of vice presidents under him, and then a layer of managers and developers. It was very fascinating because I was in front of the room, putting my slides up with my findings, and I had probably about 25 people in the room, and it was uncanny. About a third of them were back there nodding their heads. And these were mostly engineers and low-level managers. And about a third of them, who were the mid-level managers, looked like I just told them an asteroid was about to smash into Earth. And then the upper management looked angry. And the senior vice president got very hostile while I was making my presentation, and tried to intimidate me and to trip me up. And I at this point, I had been acting as an expert witness for about 5 or 6 years, and I literally remember sitting up there thinking, oh no, I have been cross-examined by top attorneys in court. You have nothing on me. I know how to do this. And he left the meeting before I was done with my presentation. And I found out later he was literally going around the company trying to find copies of my report to destroy them. And I was working for Object Systems Group, and after I had finished this, and I was done. That was the end of my involvement. Tony Gibson, who's president of OverOSG, said, "Do you have copies of your stuff?" I said, "Well, yeah, of course I have copies of my stuff." And then this is where he told me that the senior VP had basically gone through to try and destroy all the copies within the company. So I gave copies I had a slide presentation and a written report, about a 40-page written report, and he took them straight to the CEO of the corporation. And the senior vice president lost his job as a result. I'm not proud that he lost his job, but they'd spent $500 million and they had nothing to show for it. This project had been badly run from day one. Again, my favorite maxim, all the important mistakes are made on the first day. Yeah.
So like when investors, like someone invested $500 million, right?
Mm-hmm.
So like, do they not look at like the trajectory of the project? Like, how does it get to the point where it's so bad, but yet $500 million is reported to it?
Well, that's a good question. They had two big name consulting firms working on it, so it's not like, and these were names that, well, you recognize one of the two. The other one you only know if you know big IT consulting firms. So it looked like they hired the right people. It looked like they'd taken the right approach. This was going on, and it had reached the point. I was basically the one who pierced the thermocline of truth. And the CEO found out, because of me, how things actually were, and was absolutely gobsmacked by that. So, anatomy of a runaway project. Whoops. Come back here. Here, I'll just say, go take the time to read this. This is a different company. And as I mentioned, this is a project that I reviewed 3 times in 3 years, and this was the 3rd time. And it was so bad on every level. It was just so bad. And the sad thing is that the company actually thought they touted themselves as having a world-class development team. It's like, you don't realize how bad your source code is. You don't realize how bad your architecture is. You have no architecture. That's part of the problem. So I said in one point of the memo, you've taken a what's the comment I made? Yeah. Says it doesn't have a viable, consistent architecture. The irony is that it's not a big, complex problem. It's a relatively straightforward problem that's been made big, complex, and possibly unsolvable by the current implementation. This project was a year after my 3rd review. The project was killed, and the senior vice president at this company, who was in charge of the project, was let go. But literally 3 times in 3 years, I had said, you have serious problems with this project, and they would thank me and appreciate the feedback, and we'd make changes, and then we'd just continue down the same path. I mean, it's a classic Einstein quote. Insanity consists of doing the same thing and expecting different results. And they continue to do the same thing. So I'll just recommend that you take the time to read that. We won't go over it a lot. Do not defer the difficult. Okay, I've already been talking about this all semester long. This is one of the biggest temptations even great software engineers will face, which is you go after the low-hanging fruit. It's like, I'm going to do this engine, I'm going to do this IDE, I've got this library, I've got this user interface prototype, and bam, 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 bam. My gosh, look at this. It looks like a real product. And we just have a few things to do in the back. And then you get to the few things in the back, and they turn out to be far harder than you thought. And you guys have identified it right at the bat with moi. It's kind of like, okay, we're doing blockchain stuff here. We're probably going to encounter something we really don't like. So you've identified it. You know what the hard problem is, and you're seeking after that. But often, this is what causes the 90-90 syndrome. 90% of the project takes 90% of the schedule, the remaining 10% takes the other 90%. You have pushed off all the hard problems to the end, and when you start to address them, you find out not only are you dealing with some hard problems, but often the choices you have made will either make solving those hard problems much tougher than they would have been otherwise, or you end up with partial solutions for 2 or 3 hard problems, and finishing it, each of those solutions is mutually incompatible. We can't, if we finish this, it will make this impossible. If we finish this, it will make this impossible. It takes a lot of intellectual honesty and a lot of discipline, and frankly, a lot of support from management to say, these are the hardest problems we see going into this. We would like to make sure we can solve these before we do anything else. And management's going to say, well, can't you just put something up on the screen? Well, we'll worry about that later. This will be one of the hardest problems you're going to face. I'll tell you that right now. And then if you do manage to cobble something together that works, they'll say, okay, let's do version 2.0. It's like, no, we have to go back and fix a bunch of stuff. No, it'll all work. No, trust me, it won't work. We have built a palace on the foundation of an outhouse. We have to go back and do a real foundation here. And management doesn't like time and money spent on things that do not provide visible results. And they usually won't do it until things crash and burn. Okay, and those are the 3 articles, all short. By midnight, put in your 7 billable hours. Probably a good time to sit down as a team and go through all your project deliverables, remind yourself of what you're doing, update and refresh them with what you've learned along the way. I still have a few I need to grade. There are some that are due for resubmission. I trust you're resubmitting them. I'll give you all the rest of the week for any deliverables that you want to redo or resubmit, and I'll grade everything on next Monday. I just changed this to just chapters 1 and 2, not 1 through 3. Because 4, 5, and 6 are very short. I looked back and said, oh yeah, that is. So 1 and 2 are the 2 longest chapters. 3, 4, 5, and 6 are all pretty short. So just read 1 and 2 for next week. Webster 6, I don't know what that is. Watch a podcast. What is Webster? Let's see.
It's the technology.
Oh, it's a technology lifestyle. An article that I'm inordinately proud of that I wrote in 1996 called Windows Forever and Ever. And said, imagine, if you will, that Windows is still the dominant operating system in the year 2020. Here we are, Windows, I mean, we have a whole nother class of devices for which Windows doesn't really do anything. But if you're talking laptops and PCs, Windows is still like 90% of the market.
90?
Yeah, it's about 90. Between Mac and Linux. But yeah, so it's the core of those articles has to do with both the issue of technology entrenchment and the issue of technology fireflies that come and go away before you can do anything useful for them. Any of you been following the Magic Leap story? Magic Leap is a startup that's doing, they put out a great, there's a good article, I think, on Verge, The Verge, saying, why are people still giving Magic Leap money? They put out a demo video, I think 2 years ago, showing enhanced reality. So you're playing a game, you're seeing your room and everything else, but things are bursting through the wall and so on, and it was great, and so on and so forth. And it's 2 years later, and they still don't have anything they're actually shipping. They just put out a new video saying how great they are, and they've raised like $2.5 billion of venture funding. And it's unclear that they're on a path to actually ship a product anytime soon. I think that may be one of the great failed ventures of the last 10 years. So, and there are people who sort of say, okay, this is going to be a great market, we're going to go after this, and then it just never materializes. That's it. The rest of the time is for you. Do you have any other questions or anything before we go? Yes?
So what is the what is the next main deliverable then? Like,
actually, your test plan was the last main deliverable. There are only 2 remaining deliverables. One is your individual code review. So at any point when you do an actual code review, go and check that off for yourself, not for your whole team. Each of you have to do your own code. And then the last one, and you should start thinking about this now, is your video on your project. So start filming your video to tout your product, if you go back and again look at the winter wiki and go through some of the videos there, you can get a sense for it. These typically are like 2 to 3 minutes. They're usually somewhat tongue-in-cheek or at least humorous. They're often a mix between sort of an ad for the product versus, oh, here's our team and here's what we did and this is what we tried to do and here's video footage and we didn't ship but this is what we got working. No, trust me, that's a very common one. So that's it for the deliverables. Read the book, midterm in 3 weeks, and keep coding. And that's it. I will turn out.